This idea that you carried your faith and your culture in your blood, and that it could actually be handed down through your blood to the next generation, could confer permanent inferiority on a particular group of people. This toxic process was unfolding, and it reached its culmination in 1492. To Spanish Christians, they thought that God had made this victory possible. This was a final triumph, the kind of freeing of Christian Spain. We have to remove every trace of Semitic heritage. That means Jews and Muslims.
Hey, welcome to the Afikra podcast. My name is Mike Imhenna. Today on the series, I have Matt Carr, who is the author of Blood and Faith, The Purging of Muslim Spain, 1492 to 1640. Welcome to the series, Matt.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to have you on because I want to discuss this period of time. It's one of those things that I've heard about my entire life. I've always heard of al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, but I don't know much about it. So maybe let's start with a really basic first principles questions. When did Muslims first arrive to Spain?
In the year 711, when a Muslim expedition by a North African general landed in Andalusia near Gibraltar and began what turned out to be a successive waves of conquest moving further and further north. At that time, Spain was ruled by the Visigoths, who were kind of originally German and had converted to Catholicism, and they had ruled Spain, or Iberia as it was then, for about 300 years. And so this initial expedition was probably not intended as a kind of occupation conquest. It just turned out like that when basically Visigothic rule crumbled, and further expeditions followed the one in 711, until basically the whole of Iberia was under Muslim occupation, with the exception of a remote area in what is now Asturias in the west of Spain, and as far north as the Pyrenees. So this was the beginning of the formation of what was known as al-Andalus, and it lasted the whole period of Andalus from essentially more than 800 years in different forms. It came to an end finally in 1492 with the fall of the Emirate of Granada, the last enclave of Muslim Spain, after a 10-year war siege under the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. So by that time, by 1492, the original al-Andalus that came into being in the 8th century was very, very different. There was very little of Spain under Muslim rule. So you had this whole long period of kind of the creation of the Caliphate of Cordoba. You had the fall of the Caliphate. You had different dynasties and clans fighting for control, Muslim clans, often with Christian allies, fighting for the control of different areas of Spain. And then you had the process that was known in Christian Spain as the Reconquista, the reconquest, which was a kind of slow sort of grinding movement southwards with many setbacks and reversals that basically culminated in the 1492 completion of the Reconquista, as Spanish Christians saw it, with the fall of the Emirate of Granada. So it's a long period of history with lots of twists and turns.
Yeah. Before we get into the history a little more, what made you want to write the book? I mean, anyone listening to this can probably hear that you're from the UK.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Anyone watching this will guess that you're probably not from al-Andalus and you're not from the Arab world. I'm curious.
True on both counts.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit why and how you sort of fell into this history.
I can trace it quite clearly, really. I mean, my book is about the Moriscos, basically. So the whole period of al-Andalus, the early period because a lot of people think that al-Andalus just ended in 1492, and that was the end of Muslim Spain. So it's often thought, oh, that's how it ended. And there wasn't that much knowledge about what came afterwards, because the political fall of Muslim Spain, the end of the Emirate of Granada in 1492, that's one thing. But then you still have this very large population, Muslim population, still living under Christian rule, and now living under unified Christian rule. So that period, more than 100 years after that, was not and is not very well known. And I first heard about it myself in 1992 when I was living in Spain, living in Barcelona, actually, during the Olympic Games. There was a lot of talk then about the quincentennial of Columbus's voyages of conquest and exploration. A lot of talk about relations between the Muslim world and European world, obviously not called Christendom as it was then. And I heard this word Moriscos mentioned in an article I read in El País by the Spanish writer Juan Goytisolo. And he talked about the Moriscos, who were the people who were forcibly converted to Catholicism after 1492, who remained in Spain for more than 100 years until they and their descendants were expelled from Spain en masse between 1609 and 1614. And I was struck by the fact that I didn't know anything about them. I was struck by the tragedy of their predicament, that, when they were expelled, they were expelled because the Catholic Church and monarchy no longer believed that these people were capable of becoming what they called good and faithful Christians. So after many, many years, which you can talk about, during this podcast, the Crown took the decision to expel them. And when they arrived, they were often just dumped on beaches in what is now Tunisia and Algiers. And they were sometimes robbed and killed by Muslim bandits who thought they were Christians because they spoke Spanish and they dressed like Christians. So I was struck by the predicament of these people. It was a very tragic predicament that so many of them considered themselves Spanish. They adopted to Christianity, sometimes by force, and sometimes over a period of time. Some of them became genuine Christians, but many didn't. Many held on to the customs and the religion that had been taken from them. So that this struck me as an interesting, I was just thought, why have I not heard of these people? And I thought to myself, this would be very interesting to write about. At that time, I didn't trust whether I was able to write about it. It wasn't until around 2006, 2007, when I wrote a long piece about this conspiracy theory called Eurabia, which is a kind of Islamophobic sci-fi conspiracy theory, which kind of echoes the old anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of the 20th century, in that it put forward the idea that Muslims are intent on converting Europe into a Muslim colony called Eurabia. And I was struck by the whole predicament that many Muslims now find themselves in Europe. And the word Morisco kept occurring to me as a kind of historical parallel. And I thought to myself, this is something to write a book about.
Yeah.
So basically I tried, that's what I tried to do. And it was a very difficult book to write because I recognized that I was not a specialist in this area. And I saw it as my task to find out what I could find out and to take what I could find out to a readership that, like me, did not know much about it. And that's really how the origins of the book.
Yeah. I want to come back to this idea of, this community, the Moriscos community. What population size are we talking about? How many people would have considered themselves Moriscos?
We'd have to talk about how they became Moriscos, because that's a very important process. But often the figures were never entirely clear. Let's say that by 1609, 1614, when the expulsion actually took place, bearing in mind this is more than 100 years after 1492 and the fall of Granada, there were probably about 11 million people in Spain, and the estimated number of Moriscos who were expelled at that point hovers around 300,000 to 350,000. But at various times during the 16th century before the expulsion, the numbers would have been higher. For example, in 1492, the numbers were definitely higher. But what you'd have, though, in the centuries leading up to 1492, al-Andalus was no longer seen as a kind of prime destination for Muslim scholars, for Muslim musicians, for generals, for administrators seeking careers. It was no longer seen as a desirable place. It was seen as a place that was in retreat, that was basically being whittled down to this tiny corner of the south of Andalusia around Granada, the Emirate of Granada. So what you had left in 1492 was basically the proletarian base of the old Muslim society. You didn't have that many aristocrats. You would not have had that many high officials. You would have people doing kind of ordinary trades scattered around all over Spain, living in various relationships to their Christian rulers. Bearing in mind that in Granada, it had remained, it had been Muslim constantly since 711. Whereas there were other parts of Spain where Muslims had been living under Christian rule for like 200 or 300 years. So they were living in quite different circumstances.
Yeah.
So at that time, maybe you could, off a ballpark figure might be about 600, 700,000 people at that time. And so it was whittled down gradually by the end over the next 100 years. Bearing in mind, these figures are not absolute.
Yeah.
Because it's quite difficult to actually kind of come up with the firm definitions for these numbers.
It's funny. I'm using these terms that I don't know if they would be used at the time. So I'll just ask you, was the term Spanish used at the time? I mean, did people consider themselves part of a nation of Spain, if not nation, obviously not a nation state, but part of a nation, a Spanish nation? Did people think that these were identities that were conflicting, that they couldn't be Muslim and Spanish at the same time?
It was very difficult to be both at the same time. I mean, this is the contradiction, really. I mean, if we look back at sort of the early period of al-Andalus, those 800 years that we've just been talking about, sometimes this has been imagined rather romantically as a kind of golden age in which Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived happily. It wasn't like that necessarily. It was not the kind of sort of multicultural paradise that has sometimes been imagined, but nor was it the disaster that has been sometimes imagined. If you have Jews, Muslims, and Christians living in close proximity, quite often in isolation, over a long period of time, they did forge relationships between them that were sometimes amicable and at least kind of agreeable, and sometimes more than that. So that is a whole subject in itself. And so all members of all faiths use the term Spain and Spanish. For example,
to describe themselves.
Sephardic Jews, to describe themselves. Obviously, these terms, these kind of terms, don't necessarily have the connotations of nation state that they would later have and that they have now. But they were certainly the beginnings of that. And the thing is, in this period around 1492, you're dealing with a period in which the principle, who rules decides the faith, was a kind of crucial political principle for Protestant and Catholic rulers all over Europe. And so you have this kind of overlap between the idea of Spanish.
Yeah.
What is Spanish? Is Spain an entity that can incorporate Jews, Muslims, and Christians, or should Spain be Christian? And so over the 15th century, leading up to 1492, and then consolidated by the fall of the Emirate of Granada, you have the kind of development of a very chauvinistic form of Catholicism, which basically says Spain is Christian, it is Catholic, and it can't be anything else. And anyone else who is not that has no right to be here. And so in 1492, you have the expulsion of Spanish Jewry. It was like, but there's a crucial difference between what happened to Jews in 1492 and what happened to Muslims, the Moriscos, more than 100 years later. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella gave the Jews of Spain who had not converted to Catholicism a choice. They said, you either become Catholics or you leave. And if you leave, you have to kind of abandon all your possessions and just go. So probably about 150,000 Jews took that choice to leave. In 1609...
And they, sorry to interrupt you. Did they go further into Europe, or did they go to Morocco and Tunisia?
Both. They went to both places. I remember the Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan at that time, said, what fools the Spanish kings are that they expel some of the most talented members of their population and they come to us. So, some of them would go to Turkey, some of them would go to North Africa, some of them would go to Europe. In some ways, it was a kind of, you could call it a rehearsal for what happened in it was certainly a precedent. It was the first time that Spain had carried out a mass expulsion like that. But the crucial thing, the choice, when I say choice, I mean the word kind of ironically, really, because for many Jews, just as for many Muslims, to give up their religion was to give up everything. They had to make that choice to remain in Spain and be Spanish, but be Christian, or leave Spain and give up being Spanish and remain Jewish. And this was, to some extent, what happened to the Moriscos more than 100 years later. The interesting thing is, though, is that in 1492, there were people connected, moving in quite high circles within the Spanish state, who thought, why don't we get rid of the Muslims as well, expel them all, and the Jews? So in one stroke, make Spain Christian on the surface. And they didn't do that. And it was essentially mostly for tactical reasons. At that time, the Spanish monarchs had just fought a 10-year war, very difficult war, to conquer Granada. I mean, it was really like grinding, like fortress by fortress. And it was a kind of international enterprise, because you had kind of volunteers from various European Christian countries going to fight this mini crusade, as they saw it, to to defeat the Muslims of Granada. So they didn't do it in 1492. They took the decision, no, we won't do this. It's too dangerous for us, because the Jews had no country to represent them that posed a threat to Spain. In the case of the Moriscos, it was very different. So they took the view at that time, the Spanish rulers, we won't expel them, and in fact, we won't do anything particular. The actual surrender agreements signed in 1492 by Ferdinand and Isabella with the Emir of Granada allowed Muslims to practice openly and continue being Muslims as they had before. That was kind of how the surrender was negotiated. So in theory, you had the possibility of a Spain in which Muslims could still be Muslims and still be Spanish. But then, and we can talk about that as much as you like, that whole process changed and collapsed essentially, and Muslims found themselves faced with very different choices.
So the Moriscos, was this a term that they applied to themselves, or was this a derogatory term?
It was definitely a derogatory term. And bearing in mind that Spain at that time had its whole history, a whole kind of vocabulary of its own. I mean, I think we should mention one other thing, because it's also a kind of precedent. I know the thing about dealing with this whole period of history is if you deal with any one period, you end up having to go 100 years forward or 100 years backwards in order to kind of get a grip on what was actually happening. So if we go back to the late 14th century, early 15th century, in other words, nearly 100 years before the fall of Granada in 1492, you had this period of violent pogroms directed against Spanish Jews, in which tens of thousands of Jews were killed all over Spain by Christians, and others were converted literally at the point of a sword. And these Jews who converted became known as conversos. And so when the church and the crown had accepted this, okay, these Jews have been converted by force. They had this dilemma. We converted them by force. How can we believe that they've genuinely converted? Once again, this is something that will apply to the Moriscos later on. And so what was known historically as the Spanish Inquisition was created in order to police the faith of these new converts. And so throughout the 15th century, you have this constant political crisis known as the converso problem, in which the Inquisition is kind of persecuting, punishing Jews or the conversos for any apparent backsliding into their original faith. And this became a huge political problem that absolutely consumed Spain in the 15th century. And related to that was this concept known as purity of blood, limpieza de sangre, another very important concept in those years. And the idea was that each faith carried their faith and their culture in their blood, and that Spanish blood, pure Christian blood, could not allow that. And therefore you have this thing in which Jews were excluded from any positions within the church or the crown administration that could corrupt or pollute pure Christian blood as they saw it. And all this was later applied to the Moriscos. So the conversos was a word, a derogatory word, because conversos were not seen as true Christians. They were seen as people who'd had to become Christians. And when this process was turned against the Muslims of Spain, the word Morisco came into being, which kind of had the meaning of half Moor. Bearing in mind we talk about Moorish Spain, al-Andalus was often known as Moorish Spain because of its connections to North Africa. So Morisco was a derogatory term that meant half Moor. and it was the term used to describe Muslims who had converted to Catholicism, either through force or through choice.
Can I ask you a basic question?
Any question.
In your research, when you describe this political problem, is it, when you do this research, did you find evidence that this was a functional problem for society or a symbolic one? I mean, were there discourse that among pedestrians, among people who are writing in newspapers and stuff like that, that this is an actual functional problem, that the purity of faith is not high enough and this is causing problems in daily life? Or is this a symbolic problem where they just can't get over this idea that you're not pure enough?
The trouble is, a symbolic problem becomes a functional problem. It was certainly a functional problem for Jews because basically...
of course it's a functional problem for those who have their necks at the sword.
Yeah.
Not for those. I mean, for the ones who have the swords in their hand.
Absolutely, yes. Because, I mean, you were talking earlier about, Spain, what was Spanish, what was Spain in those days.
Yeah.
I mean, bearing in mind this whole period, some more or less early, what we call early modern Europe, sort of 15th, moving into 16th and early 17th centuries. This is a period of not nation-state formation in the way that we later understood it, but it was definitely a period in which nations as communities of faith were being created. And that whole idea, who rules decides the faith, that the ruler, it was through deciding the faith and through, explaining to the population that you were a king or a queen because God had made you and put you there. So religion was a way of ruling and a way of governing and a way of controlling society and a way of kind of reinforcing an incipient Spanish political identity that had to be Christian. So it was definitely seen as a functional problem for Spain's rulers. I mean, the Spanish church was obsessed by it. And part of this problem was dismantling the multicultural, multi-ethnic nature of al-Andalus. Bearing in mind, I mean, Spain's rulers at that time didn't understand race or racism the way it was later understood in the 19th century. It wasn't biological racism as such. It didn't have pseudoscience attached to it. But nevertheless, this idea that you carried your faith and your culture in your blood and that it could actually be handed down through your blood to the next generation could confer permanent inferiority on a particular group of people, be they Jews or be they Muslims. So this toxic process was unfolding, and it reached its culmination in 1492 when, to Spanish Christians, they thought that this was the kind of, that God had made this victory possible for them. This was a final triumph, the kind of freeing of Christian Spain from Muslim domination. And now that it was done, there were voices, many voices, who became more powerful over the next 100 years, who thought, we have to finish this job now. It's not just enough just to politically defeat the Emirate of Granada. We have to remove every trace of that Semitic heritage. That means Jews and Muslims. And the question is, you have this complex problem is how they did this and the problems that it presented them with over the next 100 years.
Interesting. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about 1492, and maybe we can talk, if you can help explain, and maybe this is beyond the scope of your research, but what underlying factors help lead to such a pivotal moment when the idea of a fall of an entire emirate, right, or a fall of a empire, and a retracting of an empire is hard for me to understand in 2025 in these, like, in a very easy, neat, a neat sort of wrapper, as in like, oh, this happened and all of a sudden people packed up their bags or were sent by force. What were the underlying factors that led to that fall?
Well, bearing in mind, that the fall of Granada in 1492 was seen as the completion of a process that had begun a long time ago. To the Spanish Church, if we go a long way back to 711, following these Muslim invasions and expeditions of conquest, following the kind of creation of al-Andalus, the Spanish church still existed. It was not banned. The Muslim rulers of Spain did not do what the Christian rulers later did. Christianity and Judaism were tolerated. They were tolerated in a kind of inferior status, but they were nevertheless tolerated. They were not persecuted, although there were occasional episodes of persecution. So the church continued to exist throughout those 800 years. And, the church always believed that Muslims were intruders in Christian lands, and that, they were always on the lookout. And so they were always on the lookout to reverse this process when they could. And so more or less by around the 13th century, this period that Spanish Christians called the Reconquista, in which you had, say, one Christian ruler allying with another to drive Muslims out of one particular part of Spain, sometimes, interestingly enough, with the help of Muslim allies. These alliances were constantly shifting over the 800 years. Sometimes Christians would be fighting Muslims, sometimes they'd be fighting with Muslims against Muslims for particular kind of local, regional reasons and so on. So basically, more or less by the 14th century, about 100-odd years before 1492, you only had this small corner of Spain that remained under Muslim rule. So when it was decided 10 years before to finally make this effort and finish off this last enclave of Muslim Spain, it was seen as the completion of a political process and also a religious process of finally restoring Spain to what was seen by the Spanish church as its true Christian identity. And interestingly enough, it was also seen at that time, this is just before the Reformation, it was seen by European Christians in the same way. That's why there were European volunteers who joined Ferdinand and Isabella's armies, because they saw this as a kind of as a mini crusade, really, driving Muslims, the last enclave of Muslims, not only out of Spain but out of a Europe that was seen essentially as Christendom. Europe was Christian, and Muslims had no right to be there. So you had these kind of broad religious questions and these also more national questions about Spanish identity, what it meant to be Spanish, all converging at a time when European Christendom was in conflict with the Muslim world, particularly with the Ottomans, and was actually came quite close to losing that conflict. So this was seen as part of that broader geopolitical. It was a geopolitical gain as well as a religious gain, was to take back that last enclave. Does that spell it out at all?
Yeah, for sure. That's really, really helpful. So there's two dates in the title of the book. There's 1492 and 1614.
Yeah.
Help me understand why 1614 is a useful date to keep in mind.
Well, as I was saying earlier, like in 1492, you have, in theory, a unified Spain for the first time since 711. In other words, all Spain is under the control of the monarchy of the Ferdinand and Isabella. It's under control of a Catholic monarchy. But you still have thousands, tens of thousands of men and women all over Spain still practicing as Muslims and living as Muslims in different parts of the country with different relationships to their local lords, to the crown, and so on. Like, for example, in Granada, 1492, you have a population that still speaks Arabic. In fact, probably most of the population, that would have been their first language, Arabic. So when 1492 happened, and Ferdinand and Isabella said, okay, if you give up, if you surrender, we will allow you to continue to practice your faith. Many Muslims didn't believe that's going to happen, and they just left voluntarily. No one knows how many, but people talk about thousands leaving to North Africa and so on at that time. Then if you go towards Valencia, further north on the Mediterranean, you have the second largest amount of Muslims in Spain, possibly about 130, 140,000 people, living as kind of more or less semi-feudal serfs whose masters were Christian lords. And they some of them might have spoken Arabic, but a lot of them had already become Spanish speakers by then. Then if you move into Castile itself, you have enclaves of Muslims who've been living under Christian rule for like 300 or 400 years in some cases, who are Spanish speakers, don't speak any Arabic, have some contact with kind of Islamic religious world, but not too much. So you have all these very different categories of people. And in this kind of this chauvinistic, intolerant atmosphere of reconquest, of the idea that Spain was finally recovering its religious destiny, you have very little tolerance for these people. You have a growing intolerance and a growing feeling of like resentment that, the Reconquista is not just political conquest, it's also vengeance. You defeat the rulers, but what about the people? What are they even doing in our country? They only came here through force, etc., etc. And so you have this contradiction. You have these quite generous surrender agreements in Granada, and yet you have this intolerance that is becoming more and more austere and more severe. And what happened was in around 1499, so literally less than 10 years after the fall of Granada, the Archbishop of Toledo, very fanatical archbishop called Cardinal Cisneros, went to Granada to see what was happening in Granada in terms of how Christianity was developing and how was Christianity implanting itself in what was still culturally and religiously Muslim. And he was shocked and horrified to see people worshipping outside mosques. There were about 28 mosques in Granada at that time. He was not only horrified, he was disgusted that in what he saw as a Christian country, this should still be happening. And so he began to put pressure on local Muslims to convert. And through the actions,
the pressure comes from physical violence, taxing.
He started to work on women, Christian women who had converted to Islam. He started to take them by force from their families and communities and try and pressure them to revert back to their religion. And this produced, you can imagine the reaction that had. It produced a lot of anger and resentment, and it was probably intended to do just that. Essentially, through these kind of measures, these different forms of coercion, a rebellion took place in Granada, a full-scale rebellion against Christian rule, which was put down by Ferdinand's troops. And the punishment for having taken part in that religion was that every Muslim in Granada, the surrender agreements no longer applied. The punishment was, okay, you rebelled against us, and now you have to become Christians. And if you don't, you can leave or be killed, essentially. So that happened. That's what happened in Granada, more or less by about 1502, that was complete. But then you've got this very difficult situation, looking at it from the point of view of Spanish rulers. You've converted by force one group of Muslims in Granada, but what about the rest? How will these conversions stand? How can you have, say, a group of Muslims who've been forced to convert in one part, and another group of Muslims living openly in another? And so, just as what happened with the Jews 100 years earlier, you have this rolling process of forced conversions, all taking place in different circumstances in Castile, in Aragon, in Valencia, until more or less by early 1520s, in theory, there are no more Muslims in Spain. In theory, Islam has vanished from Spain. No one is allowed to practice openly as a Muslim. And yet, and this is the whole process that takes place over the next 80-odd years, and yet, what is actually happening on the ground? Essentially, I put it in my book that, it's a problem that any government or any regime has. If you force one group of people by force to convert to your religion, how can you ever believe that those conversions are sincere? And essentially, Spain never really did. Spain's rulers never believed that Muslims had converted. They believed that it was a tactic, and sometimes it was. I mean, I'll give you an example. Maybe, I mentioned what happened on the ground, and maybe, it'd be interesting for listeners to get an idea of the difference between theory and practice. Like in Valencia, for example, you had about 120, 130,000 Muslims who basically worked on the plantations of Christian lords. And these Christian lords were quite tolerant. They didn't mind that their workers were Muslims. In fact, they believed, for reasons which have never been clearly understood, they believed that because these workers were Muslims, they were better workers than the Christians. And so they were quite happy for their own self-interest for Muslims to worship openly. And they actually didn't like having to make these people convert. It was kind of forced upon them. And so you would have a place in Valencia, a village somewhere in the countryside in Valencia, and you would be told by an official, you will now have to be Christians, all of you, or else. Essentially, that's what you'd be
just
told.
put it on the bulletin on the side of the
Absolutely, yeah. That's it. It would be as simple as that. Some official might show up at your village and they'd say, right, that's it. You've got to be Christians now. And then they'd go away. And sometimes they wouldn't come back. Because bearing in mind, you're dealing with places, little rural villages out of the way and so on. So sometimes they wouldn't come back. And then, they would come back and they'd build a church in your village. And then they'd try and explain to the villagers what it means to be a Christian, what you have to do, how often should you go to church, what feast days should you observe, which text should you be reading.
But hold on, this is, for me, the thing that I find strange about this is that like sort of acculturation would need to happen is because my impression of al-Andalus is that there were so many different communities, Jewish, Christian, Muslim. So why would they need to be taught these practices when my impression is that these communities had been living side by side already, and there was already playbooks and templates for what it looked like to be an Andalusian Jew, what it looked like to be an Andalusian Muslim, what it looked like to be an Andalusian Christian.
The playbooks had changed. This is the thing. 1492, after 1492, the playbook changed. You could argue that, leading up to 1492, that the playbook was already beginning to change. In other words, put it this way, bearing in mind that these Christian kingdoms that had slowly over hundreds of years taken back, as they saw it, little enclaves or parts of Muslim Spain, didn't at that time see themselves as Spain. They would see themselves as their particular rulers of their particular kingdoms, Castile and Aragon and so on. But when you have this idea of Spanishness and the idea that Spanishness must equal Christianity, then you have this very powerful current of intolerance bearing down on these people. So, if we look at it from, we can't be complacent in the 20th century. In the 20th century, we saw so many episodes, and we're still seeing now in the 21st century episodes of ethnic cleansing, racial and religious intolerance, and so on. This seems weird when you talk about some of these things, conversos, Moriscos, and so on, all these strange little concepts that the Spanish invented to describe their unwanted minorities. But in some ways, you're seeing what happens in any situation in which the dominant minority decides it doesn't want anything different from itself living in its territory. So once that has become kind of like the guiding principle of the state, then anything can happen. And so what did happen after the conversions of the Muslims when they became Moriscos, after that, you have this dual process. Sometimes there would be these so-called periods of grace in which the church and the Inquisition was the main repressive force, by the way. The Inquisition was the main instrument of policing the faith of converted Jews and converted Muslims. Sometimes you would have this situation, and the Inquisition would give what they called a period of grace. And they would say to the Muslim leaders of Valencia, okay, you've got 20 years to convert properly, fully. Okay, and after that we'll talk. And they would do that. And then during those 20 years, some of these villages I was mentioning earlier might never see a priest. Or they'd see a priest so infrequently that they wouldn't really have any clear idea what they were supposed to be doing. So naturally, they would continue to practice as they had practiced before. These old agreements, these old playbooks, as you put it, they would continued to live by those playbooks. But as the century wore on, it became increasingly difficult to do that because Spain became more intolerant, more chauvinistic, and also Spain became locked into a really ferocious struggle for supremacy in the Western Mediterranean with the Ottoman Empire. Spain felt at risk of invasion, a new invasion by the Ottomans. And they began to see these Moriscos as not just religious deviants, backsliders, secretly practicing their religion, even though we told them they have to be Christians, but potential fifth column. So you have this overlapping of religion, culture, and security, and it became devastating for the Moriscos. It created this dangerous country in which, if you were a Morisco, say, and people knew you were a Morisco, and you didn't eat pork, they would say, you're not eating pork because you're really a Muslim, they'd say. Or if you went to some Christian house and they'd say, have a glass of wine, and you said, no, I don't drink wine. Well, they say, that's because, and they all have to do is report you to the Inquisition, and the Inquisition would come and get you, and then you'd be interrogated, and interrogation meaning very different things to the 16th century, what it does now. And so, the country became repressive, dangerous for anybody who was not seen as a pure and faithful Christian. And that could mean Lutherans, Protestants, converted Jews, Moriscos, anybody who was seen as not like us, to put it in its most basic concept.
Yeah. To put it in a 2025 rap beef language.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, when we talk about this period of history, there are expectations that people had that are entirely different to, say, most 21st century states. But then there are other things that just repeat themselves again and again. And that was one of the things that fascinated me about writing and researching that book is, you see these kind of dynamics that recur again and again. How is it that a powerful social majority, which often feels more vulnerable than it actually is, because even though, basically by 1492, there was no way that, Spanish Christian power was unshakable by then. So on one hand, you had a very powerful state. Spain saw itself as the kind of the country chosen by God to fight for the Catholic faith, not only against the infidels, Muslims, but also against heretics, Protestants. So you have this very powerful state, the most powerful military in Europe. People used to say that in the 17th century, Spain could put something like 500,000 troops into battle in various battlegrounds, ranging from the New World, the so-called New World, to Europe. So on one hand, very powerful militarily, and at the same time felt constantly threatened by internal enemies, by heretics, by Muslim pirates known as corsairs who used to raid the Spanish coast throughout the 16th century. So, I think when you start to talk about this, you kind of find yourself thinking in quite 21st century terms. The way that, for example, this idea of Londonistans that we have now, this anti-Muslim idea that, I don't know, if you wear a shalwar kameez, that could mean that you're a terrorist or a terrorist sympathizer, and so on. In 16th century Spain, people didn't think in entirely different terms, what you wore, how you looked, what language you spoke. These were all signifiers to them. And the Inquisition would carry out these reports, and they would say things like, such and such a tailor was heard in Valencia saying that he likes the Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan. And they'd report that. And they'd go, this shows that these people are plotting against us. And of course, if you get one or two plots, you just magnify it to imagine there are plots everywhere. And let's face it, some Moriscos were definitely rebelling against Catholic repression. They felt it was their duty, religious duty, to hold on to their faith secretly, if that was what was called upon them. And there would be various kind of forms of cultural resistance. For example, if you were forced to baptize your child, Muslims would sometimes wipe off the baptismal chrism afterwards to wipe off the stain of that sacrament and so on. if a relative of yours was dying, you would not tell the church that your relative was dying so that a priest didn't come to the bedside. And so there were all these forms of cultural resistance. There were more cultural resistance than there were armed resistance. But there was, in 1568 to 1571, so the middle of the 16th century, there was the revolt known as the War of the Alpujarras. And this was a crucial episode in what happened to the Moriscos. And it happened in Granada. So you had a situation which, after more than 60 years of Christian occupation of Granada, the Spanish crown and church was still not satisfied that the population had fully converted to Catholicism. So under King Philip II, this so-called pragmatica, this special decree was issued, which basically said all Muslims in Granada must stop speaking or writing in Arabic within 2 years. They must stop using public baths, another so-called Muslim kind of signifier, and a whole range of other things. They must stop wearing Muslim clothing. This especially applied to women, by the way. Women were not allowed to cover their faces. Christian women could, but not Morisca women, because that was a sign, as Christians saw it, that they were still practicing. So this rebellion took place in the Alpujarras mountain range of Granada, in which you had volunteers coming from North Africa to fight on the side of Moriscos. And this was actually probably the worst, the most brutal civil war in Spain until the more famous civil war in the 20th century. A savage conflict with kind of massacres taking place on all sides. And after that, Spain's rulers decided, well, that's it. This is kind of, it's not exactly a before and after event, but it had a huge impact. Afterwards, they begin to think, okay, we can't convert these people. They're never going to be trustworthy. Look what they did in Granada. They murdered Christians. So the discussion becomes a discussion about expulsion. Not only expulsion, people talked about things like, and you read these documents, in the Council of State, there are things like, why don't we just castrate the entire population? That was one remedy. Another one was, why don't we just take all the Moriscos, put them in boats and sink the boats? That was another one. Or why don't we just put them in camps, and so on and so forth. So you have these people at the highest level of the Spanish church and state discussing these increasingly radical solutions to the problem that they created. And finally, it culminates in 1609, 1614 with expulsion.
And how many did they expel in 1609, 1614?
That's an interesting question. I think another thing why this is such a kind of complex historical issue is those dates, 1609 to 1614. So why do you think it took so long? Well, the answer is the Spanish crown was surprised by what actually happened. Bearing in mind, 1609, so that's, about 110 years after 1492. So in 1609, Philip III, he was Philip II's rather lazy son, decided that expulsion was the solution to the Morisco problem. The Morisco problem being the successor to the Converso problem. And he thought, he was known a notoriously lazy king. He's known as the laziest king in Spanish history. He hardly ever attended any meetings of the Council of State. But the ones he did attend, from the point of view of the Moriscos, were disastrous. Because he agreed, we can't do anything with these people anymore. They're all heretics, every one of them. So we have to remove every single one, down to the youngest child, even babies, because of the whole purity of blood thing. If we allow babies to remain in Spain, their faith will reproduce when they get older, and so on and so forth. Yeah, I know it sounds mad, but that's what it was. And so they planned this expulsion in secret, and they said it would be carried out in rolling phases. The first phase was Valencia, because at that time Valencia had the largest single population of Muslims. So in September 1609, all through the summer leading up to that, September 1609, you have these ships appearing mysteriously off the coast of Valencia. They weren't just Spanish ships. Spain had to kind of subcontract English ships, French, Genoese ships from all over Europe, and they spent the summer doing that, bringing all these ships into place And, rumors went through Valencia, what is happening? Something's happening here. What is it? No one really knew. And then you have this thing of troops lining up inside Valencia, cutting off any means of escape. So basically, Moriscos were not able to escape into Spain because there were lines of troops and cavalry cutting off those escape avenues. And then, in September, the king announces, okay, all Muslims, you have 3 days to withdraw to your houses. You can then sell what you can sell, and after that, the king's constables will arrive in your village, your house. They will march you to the coast. And that's what happened. And so you have this brutal event taking place. And this is the tragedy of Moriscos that I referred to earlier, because you have lines of Muslims basically being led out of the countryside down to the coast, sometimes being robbed and killed on the way to the coast by Christian bandits, or as Christians looking to take advantage of their weakness, basically. You have Moriscos desperately selling whatever they can sell to try and make some money for their journey. They would then arrive at the coast. They might be waiting weeks or even months for the right tides and winds and so on. And then they were just taken to North Africa and just dumped there on the beaches. And as I said earlier, some of them were killed, particularly in the kind of more lawless areas of North Africa. Once the rulers of North Africa realized what was happening, they began to make efforts to look after them. And obviously, there's no kind of Red Cross or international institution that can look after these people. So they literally have to fend for themselves when they arrive in North Africa. But as I say, once the Muslim rulers of North Africa realize what's happening, they start to make attempts to look after them and give them some kind of sanctuary. Meanwhile, in Spain, there were many Moriscos who refused to be deported. And they retreated into these mountains in the south of Valencia, and basically they found themselves, they resisted deportation to the point of suicide. There were many cases of Morisca women throwing themselves off cliffs with their children, rather than be deported from Spain. And these rebellions were put down, and eventually, so by January 1610, all Muslims.
Hold on, 1 second. Where are you finding these reports? You're talking about these reports. Are these reports that you find in primary sources, or
they were in primary sources. I mean,
newspaper clippings and public records.
No newspaper clippings. Obviously, newspapers were not the issue then. So the main sources of what happened to the Moriscos, these on the ground descriptions, come from their Christian sources. In most cases. And there were Christians who thought this was a good thing. These were Christians, some of whom had lobbied for expulsion for years. So when it finally happened, they were like, okay, good, at last. And they would be down there at the coast describing what had happened. You also have Christians who did not approve of expulsion. This is a very important thing to remember. The whole of Spain was not convulsed by this kind of deportation fever. There were some very plaintive letters written by, one of them is written by the Duchess of Cardona. Nothing much is known about her, except that she had estates in Andalusia and Aragon. She wrote to the king, and the gist of her letter was, Your Majesty, you cannot send these people out onto the road. They are old men, old women, and children. This is not Christian. This is cruel. It's unfathomable, that type of thing. He ignored all of that. All this was ignored because the idea was you expel them all to the last Morisco. That was the idea. So there were some Morisco sources. There's a few letters around, describing the journeys that they undertook. These are the ones who were kind of deported northward into Europe. And they talk about they give some indication. There are not many of those sources, it must be said. So no newspapers, but you have these Christian lobbyists gleefully reporting how much they deserved it, these heretics. Everything that's happening to them, they brought on themselves. They could have chosen to live in our lovely Spain. You actually hear that kind of language. They rejected it and clung on to their faith. So whatever's happening to them, they deserve it.
Matt, before we go, I want to ask you 2 final questions. One is, hearing you describe this moment in history, to me, it sounds like you're describing what can only be described as an ethnic cleansing. Mm-hmm. A very clear ethnic cleansing by our current day definitions. I wonder how the Spanish population would respond to you when you were telling them, your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues, when you were living in Spain, this is what I'm writing about. I'm writing about essentially an ethnic cleansing at the hands of the sort of predecessors of the current nation state of Spain. How would they respond? Is this a sensitive topic? Is this a topic that is they feel like this is part of their national story?
I think I think now the whole expulsion process is understood quite differently in Spain to what it once was. I mean, there were many years in which, we haven't had time to get into this because one of the interesting things about the expulsion was the contradictions between what was expected and what actually happened. Because, following the expulsion of the Moriscos of Valencia, the process was extended region by region to other parts of Spain. But what shocked the Spanish crown, what they didn't expect, was that it got all these reports back, and you can read them, and these are primary sources again, from local bishops saying that these Moriscos are good Christians, Your Majesty. They're actually better Christians than the so-called old ones. They should not be expelled. But by this time, the state just wouldn't listen to its own bishops. So even if you had people who had actually become what they called good and faithful Christians, they all went. So the reason the expulsion lasted so long, 5 years, was because Moriscos kept coming back to Spain. They kept returning and sometimes had to be expelled 2 or 3 times. And sometimes after 4 years, basically the Spanish gave up. What was supposed to be this glorious episode, they just abandoned it. And it was like, okay, we will no longer talk about this episode ever again. So many Moriscos would have remained in Spain or got back there and just simply faded into the background. And so, this so-called glorious episode was not seen as such, even by the people who actually implemented it. And then hundreds of years later, you have this, in 19th century historiography, began to revisit it. And it was presented, yes, as the essential episode in kind of, creating Spanish identity and so on. But by the time I wrote the book, it was seen rather differently. And of course, Spain is not the same country as it was even under Franco. This year, Pedro Sanchez, the Spanish Prime Minister, has said that immigration to Spain, a lot of which comes from North Africa, is beneficial for us. This is something that nobody would have said back in 1609, 1610, or even the 19th century. So no, I don't think. I think now it's more definitely Spaniards are more willing to accept that this was a shameful episode, not a glorious episode, and as you say, an episode of ethnic cleansing.
Okay, my last question is: I'm always curious when when somebody takes on a topic like this, how they respond to criticism. When the book comes out, obviously there's the nature of writing a book that takes on such an important and big historical topic, is that there's different ways of writing this, different ways of researching it. And I'm always curious, after reading people's reviews, people that you respect, if you were to approach the book now, how would you do it differently?
If I was to approach the book now, I've realized, since I wrote it, it's quite a long time now since I wrote that book, more than 10, 12 years, so a lot has happened. I wouldn't change any of the essential premises. I would probably put a little bit more emphasis, because the new sources have been revealed about how Morisco culture continued to exist after the expulsion. And there's certainly a whole new current of historiography that was in its early phases when I first wrote that book and has become more developed as new sources are revealed and so on. I would take that kind of thing on board. But I don't think, put it this way, when I see Trump doing what he's doing with mass deportations in the US right now, it's not as different as you might think. And also that has a strong anti-Muslim element to it too. Even though, he'll describe Venezuelans as kind of monsters and gangsters, the word terrorist inevitably comes in and the way that he conflates Palestinian with terrorist and so on. So, once again, you're seeing a very powerful country, the United States, essentially carrying out what we could call latent forms of ethnic cleansing according to a certain set of assumptions about what Americans should be and what America should be. The same thing was happening in Europe when I wrote my book, and that process has not ended. There are still voices here in Europe. Only the other day I was reading somebody in one of our local newspapers, the Daily Telegraph, was saying that expelling 2 million people from the United Kingdom, that could be a good idea. We should borrow from Trump. So, this language of this chauvinistic language of identity, this unwillingness to tolerate the so-called other, people that you've made into the other, it's something that takes a different form in each generation, in each century, but it's always a threat. And so I would not change any of those premises, because that's how I approach writing the book. That's why I kind of went back into that period to kind of present it to a 21st century readership and suggest, look, any country can do this. This was 16th century Spain, but every country has the potential to become like this.
Yeah. Do you have any recommendations of other books that folks should read if they're interested in this period?
Well, there's a lot of books by specialists, and I think, and I don't say this as a boast, I just think, as far as I know, it's still a fact. There was no book written for the non-specialist about the Moriscos. I mean, there's so many great Spanish, French, mostly Spanish, French, and American or English writers who've written about this. L.B. Harvey is one of the ones who comes to mind. And the thing is, and I also say this in my book, I could not have done what I did without them. Not in a million years. There was a few documents that I found that nobody else had mentioned in any books, but basically they did the primary research. These are people, Trevor Dadson, for example, the English historian Trevor Dadson, another really interesting historian. He's very good because he writes about how Spanish Christians opposed the expulsion and tried to protect their local Moriscos from expulsion. And he did this all by one particular village, concentrating on one particular village. And he shows how people were expelled from this village, came back to the village, got expelled again, then came back. So there's lots of historians. If you want to follow this up, you can follow particular avenues. But as far as I know, my book is the only English language book, aimed at a non-specialist readership, which tries to synthesize this very complex period of history with an eye on the 21st century.
Amazing. I wonder if there's any, I know that we're a little over, but I'm curious. I wonder if you've come across or heard from scholars, Arab scholars, North African scholars, who are also interested in this topic, who either approached you you approached while you were writing, or approached you after the book came out.
Who I approached after the book? No, I didn't really. No, I mean, I never actually. Interestingly enough, one of my most helpful sources when I was researching my book was a former Spanish Army artillery colonel who was the local chronicler in the village of Cortes de Payas in Valencia. And we had an amazing day once in which he took me on a tour of the ruins of Morisco villages in the countryside around this quite remote village of Cortes de Payas. It was absolutely blew my mind seeing it. I never heard anybody refer to these places before. You could see the actual stones of the villages, and you could imagine, these small communities of just a few hundred people. You could imagine the full horror of it. That you lived miles from anywhere, completely out of contact with the Spanish crown, and then suddenly some guys show up and they say you've got to leave in 3 days. You could picture that by these kind of bits of physical evidence. But, that was something a guy I found during the internet, and a very nice guy, very helpful, and also, interestingly enough, given his army background, not what you expect from your Spanish army officer. He was very sympathetic to the Moriscos and thought the whole thing was a total disaster and a complete tragedy. And that's why he was keen to show me this stuff. But no, I mean, I'm surprised with this book because of all the books I've written, this is the one that keeps coming back. This discussion is an example of that. There are books I wrote more recently than that, and I don't get invited onto podcasts to talk about them. And yet this one keeps trickling through. And I'm obviously personally pleased to see that. It's always good to see that your books last. But to me, I also think the reason it's lasting is because these tendencies that I described back then are still operational.
Yeah.
And that is a tragic situation, which I hope we can avoid it getting any worse.
Matt Carr, thanks so much for being part of the series. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mikey. Pleasure to be here.